Hi there! If you're new here, my name is... Okay, so I know the video hasn't even begun, but this is editing me coming in many months later because by the time I'm uploading this video, I have actually changed my name and pronouns again. My name is now Jack and I use he, him pronouns. Back to the video. I'm an autistic actor, content creator, and of course, full-time weirdo. By the way, if there are rainbows all over my face, it's because I have this really cool like rainbow filter on my window and the sun is like starting to get lower in the sky and it's filtering all these rainbows through my room, which I think makes my video just extra gay, wouldn't you say? I think I've earned like myself 3 gay points by being covered with rainbows. I don't know, let me know what you think in the comments. Do rainbows make you more gay? If you've been here for a while, this is probably the first time you're hearing from me in a little bit because I've actually been on quite a long hiatus from creating. But I'm now back in the game and really excited to chat with you all. If you've been following me over on TikTok, you will have seen my journey of coming out as trans and starting testosterone. But if you haven't been following me on TikTok, you might notice that compared to my videos a couple of years ago, I sound and look a little bit different. And that would be an astute observation, my friend. I'm not really going to get into talking a lot about my gender transition today, but I can make a separate video about those things if people are interested. Today, I kind of wanted to go old school and go right back to basics and talk about how I discovered I was autistic and what my journey with diagnosis was like. So how did I get diagnosed autistic and also as an ADHDer when I was 23, about to turn 24 years old? That is quite a late time of life to be diagnosed, although many autistic AFAB people don't get diagnosed till their 30s, 40s, or even later than that. So in some ways, I was an early bird, but compared to the common age of diagnosis for young boys or people assigned male at birth, which is around 2 to 4 years old, people missed it for a long time. They did not see the signs that they should have seen. Or maybe they did, but because we live in a misogynistic society, I think that prevented people from actually being able to recognize the odd traits that they were seeing in me as autistic. They were just like, this is a weird kid. And I am a weird kid. They weren't wrong about that, but there's also another word for it, and it's called autism. So I was diagnosed in March of 2022, and I'd realized I might be autistic about 6 months before that, in the fall of 2021. Let's rewind quickly to my childhood. Now, I'm not gonna go over all my childhood traits today because that would be an entire separate video, but to briefly summarize, I always felt different from my peers, both boys and girls. And I think some of that was definitely gender related. But I also think that my gender, my feelings about my gender, and my autism are very interconnected. Probably also should be a separate video. If you want to make this video into a drinking game, drink every time I say this should be a separate video because I have a feeling I'm going to say that a lot during this story. I always felt different from my peers, but I could never really put my finger on what it was. I didn't speak until I was 3 years old. I often felt left out in group situations. I struggled with friendships. I had intense interests, and I would have meltdowns over small changes to plan. My parents decided to homeschool me after I'd been in the school system in the UK for about 1 year. And homeschooling was actually a great fit for me. It was kind of perfect because I was at home all the time in a very safe, controlled, predictable environment, and I could spend almost all of my time focusing on my special interests. Also, I had an easier time making friends as a homeschool kid, although I still had my struggles. But some of the things that made it a little bit easier than being in school is that other homeschool kids are often quite weird themselves. A common reason that kids are homeschooled is because they don't fit in at school, or maybe they're being bullied, just like a lot of autistic kids are bullied. So there's definitely, I think, a high proportion of autistic kids amongst homeschoolers and just neurodivergent children in general. But also, homeschooled kids inherently have less options when it comes to friends, so that does make it a little bit easier. There's not a bunch of other people they can pick, so it's like, you know, beggars can't be choosers, guys. So everything was fine and dandy. I was a pretty happy kid being homeschooled until around 15 when I went back into the school system. In England, we have this part of school that you usually take between 16 and 18. I did it when I was 15 because I'm a nerd. It's called college. So not to confuse my American audience, this is not the same as university. It is a separate step that you take in the UK before you get to university. Not that I had a terrible time at college. There was lots of things I loved about college. I was able to focus on the things that interested me. Most of the topics I was studying were special interests of mine and things I was very passionate about. But I definitely didn't fit in, and it was a hard time for me in general, just adjusting to change and dealing with social situations. Now, I know that this age range, like 15 to 17, teen years in general, can be really hard for the average person because of hormones and
teenage rebellion and such.
but for autistic teenagers, it can be a unique challenge because we tend to struggle more with a lack of predictability and change. And this is a time when you're going through a lot of change. This is also a time of life where social situations are becoming a lot more complex and nuanced. And that can really become a struggle for autistic teenagers. Autistic teenage girls get very socially complex very quickly. And for autistic girls and AFAB people, it can be like riding a roller coaster or going through a maze where you suddenly feel completely lost as to what you're supposed to be doing, what they're trying to communicate to you, and how you're supposed to connect with these alien creatures. During my time in college, I did struggle to make friends, and I often ate my lunches outside. And this was also to avoid the busy cafeteria because the cafeteria was so loud and overstimulating. Please raise your hands in the comments if you also found school cafeterias to be extremely overstimulating. I think school cafeterias might be the definition of hell on earth for an autistic kid. I did not feel like many of the other kids at college understood me, and to be honest, I didn't understand them either. So the misunderstanding and general confusion, I believe, was mutual. At least there's that. Some of them were actively mean to me, but when this bullying was like less direct and obvious, especially when it was coming from young women, it went right over my head. Whew! And I would only understand that they were trying to bully me when another girl in the class, who was much nicer, would come up to me later and be like, "Hey, I'm so sorry about Tonya, like she's being so mean to you." And then I'd be like, oh, that's what was going on, because I had just been utterly bemused that entire social interaction. I often flipped from social group to social group and was sort of seen as like an odd social butterfly because of this, but I think this is to do with being extroverted and so seeking that connection, like wanting connection from other people, but because of not really understanding social cues in the ways my peers did at the time, and just having, generally speaking, a different way of communicating because of being autistic, I never really made friends with any of these groups. I would often be tolerated as like an outsider hanging out with the group, but I never made it into the group. I was never invited to hang out after school or to come to parties, for example. My only real friends during this time were my two childhood friends who I had made while homeschooling, and I was happy with those friendships because they were really deep and fulfilling. But yeah, I didn't make any new friends while I was in college. After graduating, I actually took a gap year where I worked part-time and applied to drama schools. My close friends moved away during this time. They both went off to university, and so it was a very dysregulating time for me because I was experiencing this sudden loss of structure from coming out of the school system and no longer having that routine. And also my two closest friends, my only like proper friends, moving away and going off to university without me. So it was a time for me of feeling very lonely and depressed and dysregulated. And I think, honestly, I was also in a mild autistic burnout from having gone through so much intense studying over the past 2 years and really not understanding my limits in that sense. And I remember when I look back on that period of time often being in quite a dissociative state. I don't think I really had the language for dissociation at the time, but there was definitely a lot of dissociation going on because I felt so sad and dysregulated and didn't understand why. As I became an adult, life became more and more confusing for me, just in all possible ways. After taking my first gap year, I actually took a second gap year, and this time I went to America. Now, the story of that is a whole other story. Drink if you're playing the drinking game. I just want to also put a trigger warning here to do with suicidal ideation. So if that's something that is triggering for you, please skip forward. I can put a timestamp on the screen right around here for where you can skip to pass over this topic. After my second gap year to America, I actually moved to America, which is also You guessed it, a separate video. And the change caused another long period of depression and autistic burnout for me. I had a lot of suicidal ideation during this time because I was lonely and exhausted. Being an autistic adult in a world designed for neurotypical people is extremely fatiguing, and sometimes to the extent that it can actually cause suicidal ideation for some autistic people. You're using so much brain power to try and manage things that your brain was not designed to manage. To clarify at the top, all autistic people are different, and when autistic people experience suicidal ideation, like any other person, it can be for many different reasons. But I've heard a lot of other autistic people describe getting to a place of suicidal ideation because of fatigue and exhaustion with living in this world. And that is exactly how I would have described the reason for my suicidal ideation at the time. It wasn't that I was sad or I didn't want to live, it was that living and trying to keep up with all of the moving parts and all of the chaos around me was so exhausting that it didn't feel worth it, and it felt like I just wanted everything to stop. It can get to a point where it feels like the only option for it to stop is to be not alive anymore. If you or anyone that you know is currently struggling with suicidal ideation, I do really encourage you to reach out for help. Don't keep that to yourself. Please try and find a therapist or reach out to a suicide hotline. I was in therapy at the time, and my therapist was able to monitor me while I was going through this depression combined with autistic burnout. And I think another thing that really added to my struggles during this period of time was the social isolation that I had because of moving to a different country and then being autistic and struggling to make friends in this new country. People continually misunderstood me and judged me. I found it really hard to do chores and keep up with adult responsibilities, and I was having meltdowns and shutdowns at my part-time grocery store job from the sensory overload. I didn't know at the time it was sensory overload, but looking back, that was definitely a huge contributor to my meltdowns and shutdowns. Around this time, I heard about how ADHD can present in women and other AFAB folks, and I related to this presentation of ADHD a lot. Although I don't identify as a woman, I was socialized as one, and so a lot of the signs and symptoms of ADHD in women were very relatable to me. So I actually went to a therapist to seek a diagnosis for ADHD. But because I was depressed and had these periods of hyperactivity because of my ADHD, I was actually misdiagnosed with bipolar type 2. And this is extremely common for autistic women and other AFAB people. The therapist I saw had no understanding of ADHD, let alone autism, so when I said to him, hey, I think I might have ADHD, he just dismissed it and moved on to bipolar, because I think that was something he had experience with, and I found out later on that it's actually very common for most average therapists to not really have a good education on autism and ADHD. But because this man was a professional, I just assumed that he knew best. And so I took this bipolar 2 diagnosis very seriously. And I began to track my moods so I could get a better handle on what was happening and hopefully help myself manage the emotional dysregulation. My therapist was also pushing to put me on bipolar medication. I wanted to hold off on this because I wanted to see if I could just use lifestyle changes to help instead. I now have friends who do have bipolar, and I know how important medication is for people who genuinely have bipolar, but I'm really glad looking back that I didn't go on the medication at the time because it turned out to be a misdiagnosis, and I think going on that medication would have made my journey personally a lot more complicated to figure out. So as I was tracking my moods over time, I slowly began to realize that I was not having the classic bipolar mood swings. I wasn't kind of going up into mania and then dipping down into depression for long periods of time. I was having these mood swings and emotional dysregulation, but often it was happening within a day. Like I would feel really good, and then suddenly I would feel bad and I didn't know why. I would be having a meltdown. But I didn't have the language of meltdowns at the time, so I would just be like, well, suddenly I start crying and hyperventilating and freaking out and I don't know what's happening. It took me a long time to figure this out, but eventually I realized that my dysregulation was linked to things in my environment. It took me a long time to figure that out because of my struggles with interoception and alexithymia, which I can make another video is about, but basically a lot of autistic people have poor interoception and a lot of us have alexithymia, and these things can make it a lot more difficult to distinguish what we're feeling. Hello, the lighting is probably progressively changing in this room because the sun is going down, but I'm determined to finish this story, so let's see if we can do it before I end up in utter darkness. So yeah, basically interoception issues and alexithymia can make it a lot harder for autistic people to understand and identify what we are feeling. But when I did realize that my feelings might be actually related to things happening in my environment, whoa, mind-blowing concept. The whole idea that I might be bipolar type 2 just started to fall apart, especially because I knew more and more people who were diagnosed with bipolar, and I just never really felt like I was the same as them. I was like, yeah, we're both neurodivergent, we both have something going on differently with our brains, but I don't think we're in the same family tree. Like, I think there might be something different going on in our noggins. Next, I moved from the Midwest, which is where I was living in America, to Los Angeles. And I moved to Los Angeles in 2020, just before the pandemic started and that first lockdown started. Now, during the lockdown period, this might be a controversial opinion, but I was my happiest self, at least for the 3 months that I was able to not work and just stay completely at home. I was quite privileged to be able to do that. There was lots of people who had to go to work through that whole period, but I was able to stop working for about 3 months before I had to go back to work. And during that time, I just was so relaxed and had such little stress and anxiety. And if I hadn't mentioned earlier, stress and anxiety were other huge factors that I was constantly dealing with and couldn't figure out what things were causing the stress and anxiety. There was actually a long period of time where I was in denial that I was stressed or anxious. Plot twist, I was highly stressed and anxious, but because of the aforementioned alexithymia, I didn't know that's what it was. I just thought I felt bad, and I didn't really understand that what I was experiencing was anxiety.
I could make a whole other video about that.
God, is that the 6th time I've said that? But during the lockdown, I was very relaxed because I was at home in a controlled and predictable environment. As soon as I had to go back to work, my anxiety shot through the roof. Immediate stress, immediate alarm bells, everything was going wrong. I started working at a local restaurant, and one of the managers began to bully me. Along with this, I also really struggled to communicate with my coworkers, and I was having a lot of meltdowns again at work. In 2021, I was in burnout again. So this is probably the 3rd period of burnout that I've had in my life so far. And during this period of burnout, I also experienced more suicidal ideation. Life just felt impossibly hard. I was confused as to how everybody else seemed to make it look so easy. I felt like other human beings lived life in this effortless manner, and I know that's not entirely true, but it felt like so many things that I struggled with, they thought were easy, and it felt like everybody was mad at me that I didn't just know things or I couldn't just do things the same way that they did. It was around this time that I started considering pursuing an ADHD diagnosis again. At this time, I was living with a friend named Molly, who is a very close dear friend now, and she has a brother who is autistic. And when I talked to her about wanting to pursue an ADHD diagnosis, she said to me, have you ever considered also getting assessed for autism? Well, I knew nothing about autism at the time, and I thought this comment was very, very random. Ironically, in classic autistic fashion, I didn't pick up on the fact that Molly was saying she thought I was autistic. Because Molly was being quite tactful about how she presented this information to me. Like, she didn't come up to me and say, I think you're autistic. She was like, you know, maybe consider getting assessed. And she was doing that in classic, polite, holistic fashion, because a lot of people respond quite negatively to the idea that they could be autistic, because we live in an ableist society, and there is still a heavy stigma around autism and being autistic. And so she didn't want me to get offended, even though she knows that being autistic is not a bad thing, but she wasn't sure how I felt about it. So she was being quite polite and tactful and kind of tiptoeing around the topic. But because of her subtlety, that was just totally lost on me, and I thought that it was just like a random idea that she had. I did not realize that she had clocked me as autistic from like the first couple of weeks of knowing me and had been biding her time, trying to wait for an appropriate moment to suggest that I might be on the spectrum. Although I initially dismissed Molly's comment, thinking there was no way I could have a disability like autism, because surely someone would have picked up on it when I was a child. But even though I dismissed it, a week later I was still thinking about her comment, and so I was like, you know what, I'm going to do one autism assessment quiz online. It's going to tell me there's not a chance in hell, and then I can move on and stop pondering it. So I did an online assessment and it said that I was highly likely to be autistic. And I was like, how can this be? This makes no sense. And so I thought it must be a fluke, and I decided to do 10 more online tests. This time I specifically chose psychometrics that psychologists will use when they're screening adults for autism, just so that I could be extra thorough, because I was like, okay, surely the legit screening tests will show that I am not autistic at all. Plot twist, they all came back saying highly likely to be autistic, which I'm sure you could have guessed. I found this result very confusing because my only concept of autism at the time was that it was a disability, and outside of that, I just had like this kind of Rain Man type stereotype in my mind. If you'd asked me, hey, please describe autism to me, I would not have been able to do so. But my concept of autism, because of stereotypes in the media, was this kind of Rain Man-like character. And because I didn't really relate to a lot of those stereotypes, I had a really hard time understanding how the term autistic could be applied to me. So I began to research the traits of autism, and specifically how they can present in women and AFAB people. Even though really there is no difference in autism between genders, we're all autistic. But because we live in a world where people socialize us in a binary way, sometimes you can miss things. You can miss signs of autism if you were just looking for kids who are very interested in trains. If all the little girls are told that trains are boys' toys and encouraged to play with dolls, you might miss the little girl who has an obsession with Bratz dolls and has it to the same degree that the autistic boy has the obsession with trains. And so I began to research how autistic traits are often overlooked in women and other AFAB people. And this is especially true for Black people, people of color, and queer people. Everything I learned about autism suddenly made sense of my entire life and the struggles I'd had since I was a really young kid. After researching in intense hyper-focus mode for about a month or so, I realized that I needed to quit my job, because I had 2 part-time jobs at the time, and one of them was a big source of meltdowns for me, and I just could not do it anymore. I was at a point of burnout where, in order to recover, I needed to leave that job. Thankfully, the other workplace I was in was a much calmer environment and less overstimulating, and so I was able to keep working there part-time while I was in burnout recovery. Not all autistic people are able to do this. Sometimes people are unable to work at all during burnout. And honestly, I think I could have really benefited from not working at all, but because of my financial situation, I had to maintain some kind of income, and so I just cut back on my work hours as much as possible. During this time, while I was trying to recover from my intense burnout, I continued to do autism research and then started to pursue a professional diagnosis. About 6 months later, I was diagnosed by an autism specialist who had a lot of experience with diagnosing women and queer people. During that 6 months, and after my diagnosis especially, I began to unmask as much as possible. And although my unmasking did lead to 2 relational breakups, a story for another video, it was 1000% worth it. And the upside is I'm now in very happy, loving relationships with people who love and accept me for who I am, not with people who love and accept my mask. Getting these diagnoses and coming to terms with the fact that I am neurodivergent and disabled has been totally life-changing for me. I'm now better able to accommodate myself, regulate my nervous system, communicate my needs, and ask for support. I feel like just generally I understand myself and my brain better, and I'm no longer confused when I struggle with things or when my perspective or my way of communicating diverges highly from other people. I'm like, okay, it's being autistic in an holistic world again, and it's very reassuring to know what's happening and to be able to better communicate what's happening to other people versus just being in this sea of chaos and confusion that I felt like I lived in for such a long time. So if you're autistic or suspect that you might be, I'd love to hear from you in the comments about your journey. Questions, topic requests for future videos are all welcome. Bye for now. I will see you in the next video.